All right, Biology 11 students, our next YouTube sensation is going to be our lecture on plants. The same format as before. Your lecture notes from class are going to be up here on the iPad, and then I'll use the whiteboard for diagrams or for explanations or whatever it is that I need to do along the way. So we look at plants. We'll start our conversation. Well, even before we get into it, plants kind of get a bad rap. Right? No one really wants to study them. No one thinks they're exciting. It's just plants. Let's plow them over. We need more parking. We need more super Walmarts and all the rest of it. But they really do some pretty important stuff for us. So hopefully we'll learn about that today. Hence our title here. But hopefully we'll figure out that they are actually very, very important. So plants, they are believed to have originated on the earth about 500 million years ago. 500 million is 500 million years ago, so they've been here for a long time. They evolved from early algal ancestors that adapted to a whole bunch of different, landforms that were available on Earth. And what they did is they started to break down the rock, and that erode the rock, and then form soil. And as more and more soil formed, more and more plants could develop and evolve and take over. Algae, if you remember, were protists, single-celled eukaryotes, and we discussed them in the last lecture, or a couple of lectures ago, and these are multicellular eukaryotes. Some of those protists were plant-like protists, like the euglena and algae, and the algae gave way to these plants. So general characteristics of plants, they are eukaryotic. You are eukaryotic as well. And so are the protists. This means they have a nucleus that surrounds their DNA. They have all of those other organelles like the mitochondria, the ribosome, the Golgi, the ER, chloroplasts, those sorts of things. They are autotrophs. Auto means self, and troph means feeding. Self-feeding. So they self-feed using photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, if we break that word down, means light and to make. So they use light to make their energy. They'll combine carbon dioxide and water to make glucose. But carbon dioxide and water won't just turn into glucose. You need a source of energy, almost like a welder's torch, to weld these things together, to bond them together, and that's where the light from the sun comes in. The light from the sun is what allows the plant to fuse together carbon dioxide and water. So that's the explanation of the etymology of those words, photo and synthesis. Their cell wall is made of cellulose. They have a really thick cell wall. Cellulose is actually made of long chains of glucose connected, and they just lay these chains down and overlap them, and after many, many layers of these glucose chains called cellulose, it gives the cell wall quite a bit of strength and rigidity. When it gets really bad outside, we go running indoors. Plants can't, so they have to be tough. They have to have that cell wall to keep them strong and safe in the environment that they're in. Most are terrestrial. Terrestrial means they're land-dwelling. In French class, terre is earth. So terrestrial means on the earth, the soil. So they're land-dwelling. Aquatic would be water-dwelling, but these are land-dwelling, and there are some aquatic plants. The embryos are protected by the tissues of the parent plant. We see this, a good example, this is an apple. The embryo for the plant is in the seed. That's where the baby plant is. And then it's protected by the pulp of the apple, the tissue of the apple. The life cycle of a plant is called an alternation of generations. An alternation means to go back and forth and back and forth. And we see this in plants as they alternate back and forth between a diploid and a haploid form, right? And the funny thing about this is, with the diploid and haploid form, you can see both out there in nature, and you don't realize it, right? For us, when we walk around and see another human or another dog or another cat or another whatever it happens to be, it's the diploid form. And more often than not, that's what the diploid form is in plants, right? So our diploid form is what you see most often, and it's called the sporophyte. So if you think of a fern, and I'll try to draw a fern maybe here if we can, but a fern would look like that. That's the sporophyte. If I draw a pine tree, the pine tree would look like that. That's the sporophyte. If I think of moss on the ground, that's the sporophyte. If I think of a maple tree, that's the sporophyte, or a rose bush, that's the sporophyte. So the sporophyte, the diploid part of it, is what you see when you're walking around more often than not. What it does is it produces spores. Spores are haploid cells. We talked about spores when we talked about fungi in the last presentation. So haploid cells have half the genetic content of diploid cells. If you remember, a diploid cell we indicated with 2N. Right? 2 sets of chromosomes. N is a set of chromosomes. Haploids are just 1N. They have half the amount of chromosomes as the parent structure that they came from. All right? The spores themselves are released by the sporophyte or grow off of the sporophyte, and they form plants called gametophytes. So the spores form gametophytes. These gametophytes are what produce the gametes that will form the next sporophytes. So gametophytes produce gametes and they'll form sporophytes. So the gametophytes are also haploid. And when two of these gametes fuse together, they form another sporophyte. One gamete would be N, another gamete would be N, and that would give us 2N, and we'd have another plant like this. All right, so let's take a look at this life cycle in a couple of common plants, and hopefully it will make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to move our whiteboard after we go over the first example here. So if we look at our first example, our first example is a fern. Now in a fern, our sporophyte, which we said would be the one when you're out in the woods or out in the meadow, the plant that you see is usually the sporophyte. There's our sporophyte right here. So there's our fern. You can see this in your notes. You can enlarge it if you need to. And what the fern does is it undergoes meiosis and produces haploid spores. Those spores start to grow into a structure called a prothallus. Now the prothallus doesn't look like a fern at all. It looks more like a lily pad, but it's actually part of a fern life cycle. It's the haploid part. So the prothallus then produces male gametes and female gametes. Sex cells are gametes. We talked about that in genetics. So this prothallus produces male and female gametes. A male gamete and a female gamete will fuse, and that will form a zygote, which will then form the next sporophyte, which is the adult or common form of that plant. So you can see here, the prothallus, two of the gametes have met right off of the prothallus, and the sporophyte, the next fern, is growing right off of it. And it will grow there. If you're ever out in the woods and you look under the leaves of ferns, you'll see the spores or the spore cases, and then the spores will drop to the ground. If we do the same thing, with an evergreen, right? The tree itself is the sporophyte, right? Now, here's the interesting part. You're thinking, okay, the fern had the prothallus, which was the haploid part. It was the lily pad looking thing. didn't look like a fern at all. Does this have something that doesn't look like a tree at all? The answer is no. The sporophyte here produces its haploid cells inside of the cones. And there are male cones and female cones. These are where the haploid cells are produced. These are diploid. So the tree is a diploid. It produces cones that have the haploid cells inside of it. Pollen actually contain the male sex cells. So pollen contains the sperm nuclei, right? So pollen is the male, I guess, gamete, or contains the male gametes. And then the female gamete that are in cones are eggs. It's called the same as us. Anyway, the pollen, which contains the sperm nuclei, and the egg will fuse, and that'll produce a zygote. And that zygote is put inside of a seed, which will hit the ground at some point. And if conditions are right and it's lucky enough, it will grow into another diploid. So if we go through, this is diploid, 2N. These are haploid. The pollen with the sperm nuclei and the egg are both haploid, but when they fuse together, the zygote is diploid. And then it forms the sporophyte, this tree, which is the diploid. All right? So it alternates back and forth. The cones are actually the sex organs of the evergreen tree. Kind of a weird thing, right? But that's what they're there for. They're the reproductive structures. So I'll let you can get that down. You can pause the video now. I'm going to erase it so we can keep moving. But if you want to get that down, just pause the video and we'll go from there. So who are these plants that are walking around here? We're going to talk about 4 major categories of plants, all right? So I'm just going to whip through these first of all. So the first major category of plants are the bryophytes. The bryophytes are things like moss, right? Also liverworts and hornworts. These are very, very small plants. They're not big like trees or bushes or anything like that, or even ferns. Ferns are gigantic compared to these things. These tend to be the smallest plants. And the reason for that is they don't have any vascular tissue. So there's no vascular tissue. All the other plants have vascular tissue. These don't. And what vascular tissue does, it's kind of like arteries and veins. They transport substances through distances in the bodies, right? So they're kind of like blood vessels in a way. Plants don't have blood. They're like our blood vessels. So if our brain makes something really important that our kidneys need, it goes into a blood vessel and the blood carries it there. So we can be larger because our different specialized parts can share what they do. These plants don't have that ability to share. There's no transportation or highway throughout the body. So they have to be very, very small. So most of our bryophytes are very small in size when compared to other types of plants. To reproduce, they have to be in or near water. So if you look a lot of the moss, where you're going to find a lot of moss, coastal areas, valleys where there's rivers or streams or little pools or ponds, right? You'll find moss there. You won't find moss in the middle of a dry area. You won't find moss in a high area where water doesn't gather, right? It'll be in the low-lying areas. And the reason for that is the sperm are free swimming, just like ours. So they need a liquid environment to get to the eggs of another moss plant. Why are they important? Well, we use them for substances like peat. Peat can be used as a fertilizer if your parents garden or if you're a gardener. You sometimes use peat moss as a fertilizer for plants. It breaks down and the plants absorb the nutrients. Also, peat can be dried out, compressed into pellets, and these pellets can be used in stoves and stuff like that. So they can be used for a fuel source. Also, peat bogs are huge storage areas for carbon dioxide, right? So atmospheric carbon dioxide gets absorbed by peat bogs, and the peat it grows so quickly because it's such a small plant. So you can scrape the peat off of a bog and make your various products from it, and it will grow back very, very quickly. So we look at some pictures here. Here's a valley. Now you can go through these pictures yourself and take a look, but the first one's a valley, much like the Rouge Valley right next to Pickering, and you can see how wet it would be here with the stream running through it. And any time that it rained, all the water would run down and lie in these low-lying areas. So lots of moss around there. Here's a coastal area, and in a lot of the coastal areas where a lot of the sea spray and that comes along, you've got a lot of moss and other types of bryophytes living there. And here we can see the moss, and then we see these other brown structures here, and these are reproductive structures of the moss. They're the two different forms. We said there's going to be a diploid form and a haploid form. So that's those. Now, the other three types of plants are vascular plants. So they have the quote unquote blood vessels or conducting tubes that can carry things. So these plants will be much larger than things like moss. So vascular plants are called tracheophytes. Your trachea is a tube, right? So tracheophytes are vascular plants. Just think your trachea, it's a tube. Now there are two types of tubes. There's xylem and phloem. Xylem carries water, and phloem carries nutrients, or I'll put food here. All right? So the easy way to remember that is water starts with W, and W and X are right next to each other in the alphabet. And phloem and food both start with that F sound, even though this one starts with a PH. You get the idea. Phloem, food, and W and X, water starts with a W, right? So they carry water and food throughout the plant. So if you have conducting tubes, you can grow to a much larger size. Now we're going to break these down into three groups. We've got our spore-producing plants, which are the ferns. We just talked about a fern producing spores. Gymnosperms, which means naked seeds. These are your evergreens and different things like that. They have the cones. And then we have angiosperms, which are flowering plants. They're flowers. The seed is tucked inside of a fruit. They produce fruit and food for us. Very important. So we'll look at our spore-producing vascular plants. So ferns, their family is called Pteridophyta. Now, pterido means wing. And you think of wing, you think of a feather. And a fern actually looks a lot like a feather when you look at it up close. All right, so it looks like a feather, pterido meaning wing. So that's where the name kind of comes from for the ferns and their relatives. They have vascular tissue. So they do have the xylem and phloem to carry stuff, so they can grow to be, much larger than moss. And they produce spores. So they have spores that they use. These spores, like I said earlier, are quite often found on the underside of the leaf. Here we'll find ferns, club mosses, and horsetails. You've seen these if you've ever gone for a walk down by Frenchman's Bay, or if you've ever gone through the Rouge Valley for a walk. You've seen all of these things. They're quite common. They have to grow close to water or where water gathers. So in valleys, if you think about the Rouge Valley, if you ever bike through it, the paths that are there, once you get down to the bottom of the valley, there's ferns everywhere. And I've got a picture here that's very similar to that. And that's, of course, because all the water, when it rains or when all the snow melts, all the water gathers at the bottom there. They have reproductive structures called sporangia. These little brownish, reddish, orangish cases that are found underneath of the leaves on the underside, and that's where all the spores are produced. And what's their use? Why are they so important? Well, they're a food source for many forest creatures, not for us necessarily, but for other things. And we use them for aesthetic purposes, which means they look nice. So we'll use ferns in our house, we'll grow ferns or something like that. So they're used for aesthetic purposes. So we look here, there's our picture, like we said, of the base or the bottom floor of the Rouge Valley, and we can see a path walk through here and ferns just everywhere. Again, this is where the water is going to gather, and these things thrive there. There's a sporangia on the underside of a fern leaf. So we can see all of these would produce spores. And these are horsetails. Again, I've seen these in Pickering through various walking, from walking around and that. These are quite common. You've probably seen them, didn't know what they were, but they're called horsetails. And there we see some more there. All right. So our next group of the four. So Pteridophyta is group number 2. Group 4 are the gymnosperms, or group 3, sorry, are the gymnosperms. Right? What that comes down to is naked seed. And the naked seed means it's not encased by a fruit, right? The seed of an apple or a plum, it's surrounded by the fruit. The seeds here, we know, originate in the cones. We just mentioned before, the cones are the reproductive structures of these things. You can have female seed cones and male seed cones, and I've noticed around the school we've got the evergreens that grow by our football field there, between the football field and the parking lot, and an interesting thing happens. So if I quickly draw a pine tree here, what I've noticed in those trees is you've got the 2 types of cones. The female cones tend to be rounder and more robust, and they're down here. They're from about midway down the tree. So all the female cones are in this area. The male cones are more long and slender, and they're found usually in the top half of the tree. And the reason for this is they don't rely on birds and bees to carry their pollen around. They rely on the wind, but not every day is windy. So what happens is, if it's not a windy day and the pollen falls, because the male cones are situated higher, there's a chance that they will fall directly down below and be caught by the female cones. Plants can self-pollinate or self-fertilize. So look for that next time. If it gets nice out and we ever get back in the classroom, we'll go out one day and look at these. The male cones tend to be near the top of the tree, and the female cones are from the bottom half. All right? Gymnosperms, you have no problem seeing them. If you think about pine trees and other types of evergreens, they're gigantic, a lot of them, quite, a lot taller than their house if you allow them to grow. So they're not hard to spot like moss or ferns might be, smaller ones, but very large plants. They're a major food source. We don't eat a whole lot of evergreens. All right, we're more into angiosperms, the next grouping. But a lot of creatures will feed off of things and parts of gymnosperms. And for us, their main thing is shelter. We build our homes using pine, and pine trees dominate the boreal forest regions of Canada, which is pretty much all of Canada. But we build our homes from the wood that they provide. So very, very important that way. And of course, at Christmas time, we decorate them. They look really nice. So we look here. There are some cones there. We can see these are the reproductive structures of the gymnosperms. There's an up-close cone. So here's a cone that has already opened up and released its seed, if anywhere produced. And this is this year's cone. Whenever you look at a plant, this year's growth, the new growth, will often be a different color. In this case, it's much lighter in color than the previous year's growth, or older year's growth. So these are new cones that are just starting to form, and this is a dried up old cone from last year. This will dry up, the water will be cut off for it and will fall off. We have no more need for that. We have these. Here's the coast of BC, and you can just see the pine trees are everywhere. Like I said, the boreal forest is the largest biome in Canada, if you can remember from grade 9, and pine trees just dominate it all across Canada. Our last group, the angiosperms. Just going to get a quick drink of water. Our last group, the angiosperms, these are the flowering plants. These are key for us. The other plants are pretty important too, but these ones are very, very important to us. So angiosperms are flowering plants. Their seeds are encased in a fruit. So if we think about it, we have an apple here, right? The seeds are inside the middle of the apple near the core, right? So the seeds are protected by the pulp of the apple. The fruit is actually the ripened ovary of the plant. So when you're eating an apple, what you're really eating, or any type of fruit, is the ovary that has been fertilized in the plant. If you think about it, these were once eggs. Eggs are kept where? In the ovary. A little food for thought. Anyway, they're the most successful plants. They dominate everywhere. You can go anywhere on this earth and you're probably going to find these guys. You won't find moss everywhere. You won't find ferns everywhere. The gymnosperms you'll find in a lot of places, but these things, the angiosperms, the flowering plants, you will find everywhere. They're able to dominate. They have flowers. As we said before, the flowers is a key feature here, and the flowers are the sex organs of these things. So think about that next time Valentine's Day rolls around, or Mother's Day rolls around, and you give your mom or your girlfriend or boyfriend some flowers. You're giving them the sex organs of plants. Kind of a weird thought, but that's what the flowers are. They're the reproductive structures. Angiosperms, incredibly important because they're a major food source, right? Apples, tomatoes, pumpkins, plums, all of these things are foods for us. Or they provide food for other things that we eat. So for example, a cow, if we eat a cow, cows eat plants, right? If a pig eats plants, then the plants are feeding us indirectly through the pig. So angiosperms are very, very important. They're the major food source for living things, either directly, like us eating them, or indirectly, where we eat something that eats the plants. And they're very pretty. They're used for aesthetic purposes as well. You can make big money. A guy I used to play baseball with, Danny, he runs a flower shop back in New Waterford, and he does very well selling flowers for weddings and funerals and whatnot. So that's it. One interesting thing I just want to kind of mention here, which will connect the flowers and the fruit in a second. So if we have an apple tree, there's our apple tree. And what will happen is in the spring, we'll see apple blossoms on the tree. So all little flowers. These are terrible looking flowers. I'm drawing. My art skills are a little rusty. We'll blame the pandemic for that. But let's say these are all flowers. Apple blossoms, right? We call them. What happens is these apple blossoms contain, these flowers contain the sex organs. Some flowers are male, some are female, some have both male and female parts. And what happens is there's two types of sex cells. The male part are the sperm nuclei, which are in the pollen. So the pollen contain the sperm. The female part are the eggs, and the eggs are found in the ovary, which is at the base of the flower. The pollen is also made in the flower. So both the male gametes, the pollen, which contain the sperm, and the female gametes, the eggs, are made in the flowers. So we've got sperm and egg all throughout these flowers. All right? What happens is insects come in and they want to drink the nectar out of the flowers. Now the nectar is a sweet, fragrant fluid that is produced at the bottom of the flower. And so when birds and bees go and get that, they bump into the parts of the plant that make the pollen. So they get the pollen granules stuck to them. Then they go and fly to another flower, and some of that pollen later on fertilizes the eggs of that flower. So that's why the sex talk, or at least in my day, was called the birds and the bees. Because this is what helps facilitate sexual reproduction in plants. So the birds and the bees talk is actually the sex talk, or the nickname for the sex talk. Anyway, so I know there's an apple orchard on Taunton near Westney. There's an apple orchard there, a number of apple trees. And so what happens is early in the spring, I'll see all the flowers there. And then you give the birds and the bees a chance to pollinate. They go around drinking nectar from that tree and then that tree and its flowers. And next thing you know, all the pollen is being shared about. What I start to see a couple weeks later is all the petals are falling off of the tree. All the flowers are disappearing. And after another week or so, there's no flowers. All the flowers are gone. And then several weeks after that, we have apples. All kinds of apples, almost as many apples as there were flowers. And there is a connection. So the connection is this. If I were to look at a flower, a very simple diagram, there's the petal of the flower. And this is where the flower connects to the branch and the rest of the tree. At the base of this thing is the ovary, and we're going to see that in the next slide. The ovary is here, and that's where the eggs are. So it's at the base of it's in a vase-like structure. We'll talk about that in a second. The pollen gets on here, so the bee and the birds and the bees want the nectar down here. It's at the base of the flower. When they come in, some of the pollen gets stuck on the top here of this structure. The pollen then burrows down and fertilizes these eggs. Well, the plant goes, awesome job, flower. You were supposed to make seeds, and now the pollen has gotten to the eggs. You're making seeds. The seeds contain the zygotes, which are made from the pollen and the eggs fusing together, the sperm nuclei of the pollen and the eggs fusing together. So what happens is these eggs now become embryos encased in a seed. The plant goes, great job, flower. We don't need you anymore. So it cuts the flower off of resources, and the petals just drop off. And that's what happens. The petals drop off after a while. Why? Because the flowers have all been fertilized. So that means these flowers are no longer with us. And we end up with this thing. This thing now is given lots of sugar, and it grows. And it grows like that, but because of the weight of it, it now hangs down. So if I redraw that, here's our branch. The flower is nice and light, but now we've got this thing growing where the flower was. And inside we've got the seeds. We used to have eggs, but now they are fertilized, so they are seeds. This is an apple. And like we said before, the apple is the ripened ovary. And inside now we've got the seeds, which will produce the next generation. So that's the connection between flowers and fruit. All right. So here's some flowers here that we can see. There's some nice purple flowers there. I can't remember the name of them at the moment to save my life, but maybe one of you guys knows. There's a wild rose bush there. We have these beside our school. Between the portables and the road beside our school, we've got lots of rose bushes. There's a nice one here. So here you can actually see the structure I was drawing before. It looked like a vase in the center of the flower. There it is there. So there's an above view. We see all the petals, and the nectar would be produced in this dark area that surrounds it. All right, so now we're going to draw a picture of a flower. I've got one there. I'm going to draw our own and label it. This flower diagram, I love it. Very, very important diagram, because this is how the world gets fed. Again, this flower diagram that I'm about to draw, I love it. It's very, very important. All right, hint, hint. So, flower anatomy. I'm going to leave this up here, all right, but I'm going to use the full screen. So right now you might want to pause it. If you don't have this, no, well you should. Don't worry. This diagram I'm going to draw right here, simplified, but with all the same labels, all right? So if we look here, A familiar phrase from class, you know what really grinds my gears? People that plant corn and expect wheat. Since we're doing plants, I thought that was pretty accurate. Thank you, Peter Griffin. Great job. I'm going to move you out of the way, and we'll do our flower here. So our flower, so food comes from plants, pretty important. When they run photosynthesis, they make oxygen, which we need to breathe. Pretty important. All right? Stupid flowers. What do they do for us anyway, right? All right, so our flower is going to be a red flower like a rose. So these, of course, are the petals. You will probably want to get the same diagram down. This part here that folds out from the base of the flower, this is the sepal. And this, where it connects to the rest of the plant, is called the receptacle. Now, these aren't sexually related parts. The petals are just there to attract birds and bees. They're brightly colored, so it's kind of like a big sign saying, hey, over here, this is where the nectar is. And these are protective structures. While the flower is developing, we see this with dandelions in your yard. When the flower is developing, these little leaves here surround the flower until it's ready to bloom. Now the inside parts. Inside we've got a vase-like structure. All right, and it has 3 parts. We'll put the female parts over here. So the top part is called the stigma. The neck of it is called the style. And of course, down here containing the eggs, this is the ovary with the eggs inside. All right? This pink part, the vase, the top, the neck, and the base of it, makes up what's called the pistil, or the carpel. You'll see both names depending on what you read, but either way, this is the female part of the plant. So the pistil or the carpel, I believe our books used pistil back in the day. So the pistil, the female reproductive system, has these 3 parts. The male part of this thing are these things here that pop up from the base of the flower. So I'll kind of draw one through here. And this is where the pollen is produced. Remember, the pollen contain the sperm nuclei. So this is the male part here. Where the pollen are made, that's called the anther. And this thin supporting structure is just called a filament. And this part of it, the male part together, is called the stamen. S-T-A-M-E-N. Trying to squeeze it in so you can see it. And this is the male reproductive system. So the anther produces the pollen, right? That contains the sperm nuclei. And then the pistil contains the ovary and eggs. And what we try to do is get pollen from here to land on the stigma. The stigma is called the stigma because you think about a stigma, it's something that sticks to you. It's sometimes not a good, good thing, but it's stuck to you. And that's why this is called the stigma. It secretes a fluid that's like pollen glue. And the sperm nuclei will burrow their way down and fertilize these seeds. And like we said before, the petals will fall off and the fruit will form. Anyway, there's a great looking flower diagram. And pause the video. Get that down into your notes now. And like I said, I really, really love this diagram. Anyway, that's it for plants. Very, very important and often overlooked. Anyway, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can fill in a comment on the YouTube comment section below the video, or go to Edsby and get a hold of me there and let me know what's going on. All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.